Thank you for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. With Canadian Finance Minister Minister Freeland set to deliver her financial update on December 14th, it's a good time to check back with the Parliamentary Budget Officer for Canada, Yves Giroux. We'll discuss some of the PBO's recent reports as well as the general state of the country's finances. Welcome back, Mr. Giroux.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clement.
First of all, I guess, just give me your general assessment, your office's assessment of the fiscal situation within the Government of Canada.
So we forecasted that last year's deficit for the year that ended in March would be about $335 billion, which is probably the highest deficit on record. We don't know whether we hit the mark or not because the minister and the government has not yet released the final numbers for 2020-2021, which is usually done in September or October. And here we are waiting for the update, and we still don't have that number. That being said, it wouldn't be surprising if the final number came in better than expected. So a deficit that could be slightly lower than what we expected to be $335 billion. So that's for last year. For this year, we expect the deficit to be about $140 billion. But again, that will depend on the evolving situation, especially when we consider Omicron, and depending on whether the government is spending more than we anticipated last time we updated our fiscal projections, and that was just before the federal election. So we are due to update these early in the new year in 2022, but the latest fiscal and economic projections that we have released indicate a deficit that will be in the $130 to $140 billion range for the current fiscal year, which should go on decreasing, assuming the government doesn't spend more, which is remains to be seen, I would say.
Yes, of course, we know that minority governments tend to spend a little bit more money than the majority governments just to grease the skids and get past Parliament on some of these issues. Aside from that, though, that's a political comment. I'm interested in your analysis whether this $140 billion number, is that due to increased economic activity, increasing the taxation coffers of the government, or is it a reduction of spending by the government, or is it a combination of both?
It is mostly due to the reduction in extraordinary temporary spending related to COVID-19, which we estimated will amount to well over $300 billion over a couple of years, mostly the first year and to some extent the second year of COVID-19, so last year and this year. So it's mostly due to that, but there is also one element of reduced revenues, especially on the personal, corporate, and to a lesser extent, the GST, but mostly income taxes, which saw a small dip. But what we found as the numbers came in over time was that the dip in revenues was smaller than we expected. So when the economy was put in lockdown early in the pandemic, we expected a catastrophic decline in government revenues, but it didn't turn out to be as bad as initially expected. So all that to say, the shift from a deficit of over $300 billion to something that's smaller but still high, 130 something billion dollars, that is mostly due to the winding down of extraordinary COVID-19 support programs.
Any understanding why the revenue loss was not as big as people thought it was going to be? Was it people finding a way to earn money in the economy, or what was going on?
Well, it's probably something that we will still have to decipher or look at over the coming months. But it seems to be that the economy was more resilient than we expected. So even though people and the economy was in lockdown for significant segments of the economy, people still managed to work and be productive. The government support also contributed to sustaining the economy, and generating some revenues because people still had an income, those that were laid off, and they were able to continue to spend. And there's also probably an element of borders being closed,
Right.
with Canada being a net importer or exporter of tourists.
And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Monsieur Yves Giroux. He is the Parliamentary Budget Officer for Canada. Monsieur Giroux, you've released several reports recently on specific topics. Are any of them that you want to talk about in terms of understanding the fiscal situation of the country?
Oh, I could talk about any and all of these reports, so pick and choose, but I could probably highlight the First Nation Water and Wastewater Report,
Right.
which indicated that the government has spent billions of dollars and has earmarked funding totaling well over $6 billion over 10 years. But despite that increase in spending, significant spending, in fact, there are still a significant proportion of First Nation water and wastewater systems that are at either high or medium risk of failing to provide clean drinking water to the communities they serve. And we have looked at the systems that serve 550 communities. What we found is that over a 10-year period, the government is allocating more money than what we deem necessary in terms of infrastructure spending. So to spend and to build these water and wastewater treatment systems, there's more money than seems necessary, but there's a gap in the operations and maintenance funding for these same water and wastewater systems, which is a bit counterintuitive and also a bit concerning, because it's one thing to build these systems, but it's all equally important to maintain and operate them properly, because a system that's not properly maintained or not operated by people who are qualified is as if there was no such system. That's essentially something that needs to be very well maintained and operated 24/7. If the First Nation inhabitants can rely on clean drinking water at all times.
No, that's very interesting, and I am interested that you did that report. Do you have discussions with the Auditor General about what that office is doing versus what your office is doing, or is there a collaboration at all?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a very good collaboration between our two offices. We have different but complementary mandates. Mm-hmm. To summarize, the mandate of the AG, the Auditor General, is to look at how money was spent, how much was spent, and what went wrong or what went well. In my office, we're concerned about what things will cost, how things are likely to evolve. So we often need to look at what happened in the past to be able to confidently or to be able to project what will something cost and how will things evolve. So we often have to rely on information that was that's historical, so retrospective information. And when we have to look at similar or identical issues, for example, in the case of infrastructure programs, we gathered information that was very useful for the AG when she did her own audit of the Invest in Canada program. So we collaborate regularly, and we have different mandates, but we try to exchange information when it is useful for us to share information and avoid duplication when going back to departments, and also to ensure that we're provided with information that is consistent between our two offices. So yes, we do collaborate to reduce duplication and also to enhance our respective efforts.
We've got a minute just before the next break. Just wondering again on the COVID, you referenced the COVID crisis, and now we've got this Omicron situation. I'm not sure it's a crisis yet. How difficult is it to forecast in your office, given these variants and these things that just come out of nowhere all of a sudden?
Well, it's very difficult at first. So when the pandemic first hit the country, it was really a head scratcher to figure out ways to make projections, determine what would be the impact on the economy, on the government's finances, because it was unknown, at least for us. Maybe some wizards out there knew exactly what we were getting into, but we had no idea. So first wave hit, very difficult. Second wave hit, then we had a little bit more experience, not that much, but third wave and so on, we also realized that as the successive waves did hit Canada, the resilience of the economy and of the country more generally was building up, and each wave successively had lower and lower impact, certainly on an economic perspective.
Obviously, one of the things that has been in the news is the supply chain crisis, the fact that goods and services that are being delivered with less certainty. And of course, this is affecting also prices that Canadians are paying for staple products. Is this something that your office would kind of track or have regard for when you're making your forecasts about government spending and the cost of government per se?
We certainly keep an eye on the impact of supply chain disruptions on the economy, but also on the inflation. Because our office is interested in providing information and analysis to parliamentarians and Canadians on the state of the economy, whatever affects the economy, we are interested in following. So supply chain disruptions could have an impact on the economy, on certain sectors of the economy, but also on inflation. And that's why we keep an eye on their evolution and their impact on consumer prices, but also prices more generally in the economy, as well as the potential for these disruptions to become more, I wouldn't say more permanent, but to become longer in time. So it's something that is, again, unheard of and new for many economists, but it's something that we, of course, keep a close eye on.
And I guess the adjoining question to that is, are you concerned or are you having regard for how inflation is affecting government finances?
We are concerned, but not overly concerned at this point. We believe that the inflation, the rise in inflation that we are seeing over the last several months is probably due to a couple of factors, most of which should be transitionary or temporary. For example, there's the base effects, and the base effects refers to the fact that we are comparing prices this year to those of last year, 12 months ago. And because some prices were artificially depressed last year, gas and energy prices, for example, it leads to, when these prices return to normal, it leads to an increase in percentage-wise. So there's that. There's also what we talked about, supply chain disruptions that are in good part due to COVID-19. The fact that some countries and some industries down tool because they were expecting demand, and they had difficulties with their employees, so they were expecting production to decrease, and they had to ramp up all of a sudden. So these should go away or ease over time. And there's also the fact that governments across the world have poured billions, dozens, hundreds of billions of dollars into the economy. So that is a contributing factor to inflation. So yes, we are looking at inflation, but we believe that the Bank of Canada is very well equipped to return to something that is much closer to its 2% normal target.
We have the fiscal update from Minister Freeland on the 14th. I know it's not your job to predict, and I don't want to force that on you. But maybe just take our viewers through a little bit of how this process works. The minister delivers her update. What happens then when it comes to your office and the reaction to that?
So when the minister tables her economic and fiscal update, or fall statement, whatever the name is, we will be looking at what is included in this document. Sometimes there are budgetary measures, new spending, tax measures. Sometimes it's just a plain statement with numbers indicating what was the deficit for last year, government revenues and expenditures this year, as well as the next couple of years. So we will look at whether these numbers make sense and are consistent with our own view of the economy. We'll also be looking for a couple of elements this year. For example, the budget numbers for last year, the deficit figures, they still have not been released, and they should have been released in October, September normally. And even that is late by government standards because some provinces release these numbers earlier in the year. So we're really due for that. So we'll be looking at whether this gets released at the same time of the update. And we will also be looking, or we are hoping that there'll be an announcement either before then or on the day of the statement as to the renewal of the Bank of Canada's mandate when it comes to inflation targeting, because the current agreement ends at the end of December.
Right.
And it's cutting very close to the wire, very last minute.
Please stay with us. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm here with Monsieur Yves Giroux. He is the Parliamentary Budget Officer for Canada. Monsieur Giroux, love to get a sense, about how you decide what is a risk to the finances of the country and the nature of that risk. So how do you track fiscal and economic risks that are impacting on the government expenditures?
So that's an interesting question, and one I didn't expect. So you're catching me a bit off guard there. So we look at the materiality of any one element in the Canadian economy. For example, if there is no provision for an element that we know is likely to happen, for example, an economic slowdown, and that is anticipated because we're at that point in the economic cycle where the growth has been ongoing for a long time, which is not the case. We look at whether the government has factored in some prudence in its own forecasts. If it's not the case, then we will flag that as a risk. For example, a risk that the deficit figure could be worse than what the government expects, or if we ever get back in that world, the risk that the surplus figure could be lower than what the government expects because there is no factor for prudence. So we will look at that. We also look at whether there is an element of prudence in other elements of fiscal forecasting, economic and fiscal forecasting. For example, if the government has indicated that it expects the price of oil to be very high, much higher than the consensus is, we will flag that as a risk to the economy. The government is relying on very optimistic price of oil. We also are aware of what's going on in the broader world. For example, if we see that there's a protectionist administration in the US, we will flag that trade risks are present and they're on the downside, meaning that the risks could materially impact negatively the Canadian economy. So we look at what's happening on the world economy. We also look at what's happening domestically, and we try to reconcile government forecasts with those of our own office, as well as those of the private sector and think tanks. And if we see there's a disconnect between these, we flag these as a risk. Also, because we're economists by training, the majority of us, we look at what are outliers in the Canadian economy. And one such outlier for a number of years has been the high level of debt of Canadian households. So given that households have high level of debt compared to their disposable income, there's a risk that households could decide suddenly to reduce the level of debt. For example, if interest rates rise or if there's unemployment. So households could decide to reduce the level of debt they have. And one way to do that is to save more. And that means consuming less, which also means lower government revenues, notably GST and income tax revenues. So that's in a nutshell how we try to look at which risks are material and we try to quantify them to the extent possible.
That's very helpful to know that. And I actually learned a couple of things with that answer. So thank you for that. Just following up, we've got about a minute left. U.S.-Canada trade has been a major irritant in just in the last few weeks and months. So would you put that as a high risk right now?
Probably not, because we have a new trade agreement that has been renewed relatively recently. There's not an administration that is particularly belligerent in the US vis-a-vis Canada, although they have their own protectionist tendencies at times. But overall, I would say that even though there are trade irritants, the vast majority of trade between Canada and the US is done almost frictionless. If you consider, if you make an abstraction of the crossing of the border, that is at times lengthy. But other than that, we tend to focus mostly on the issues that are contentious, forgetting that the vast majority, way over 90%, probably over 95% of the trade between Canada and the US proceeds relatively seamlessly.
Fair enough. Yves Giroux, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been very enlightening, and I know you're going to be busy in the next few days and weeks, so I wish you well.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Well, it looks like Yves Giroux, along with the rest of us, will be watching Minister Freeland's comments on her fiscal update very, very closely, and we'll be following that as well. Thanks for watching today.